Hello, everyone, and welcome to
Tracing Text.
Coming to you all the way from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee.
I'm Sylvia.
And I am Anton.
And today we're going to be recording episode 2.
Which is going to be an episode about something that's very interesting to me, and I hope it will be interesting to everyone out there as well. The novels of Miguel de Cervantes, and particularly the Exemplary Novels that he published in 1613. But before that, there's something that we would like to talk about very briefly.
Go ahead, Anton. Tell me, what do you want to tell us?
I'm very excited about the fact that this morning I woke up, and the first thing I hear is that Bob Dylan has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature.
That's awesome. I'm really excited about that as well. I was pretty happy because it's someone who you wouldn't think would win the Nobel Prize. It's not like your traditional novelist or poet. So it's a really exciting news, and it's exciting since he's an American.
And it is somebody from outside academia, and somebody who is very important to me personally because my father is a huge fan of Bob Dylan's, and I remember listening to Bob Dylan pretty much ever since I can remember. So congratulations to Mr. Robert Zimmerman, also known as Bob Dylan, the new Nobel Prize laureate for literature.
Congratulations to him. So I guess we should then get back to our topic, Anton. You said that you're going to be discussing 2 exemplary novels written by Miguel de Cervantes. Maybe you could tell us exactly what you mean by exemplary novels.
Well, the exemplary novels were published in 1613 by Miguel de Cervantes, and they are short novels or long stories. And they are called exemplary because in some cases they have, in most cases really, they have some sort of an example that we may or may not follow. In the case of Cervantes, we have to be very careful because every time we talk about Cervantes, we need to be on our toes. He may be saying something and meaning something else. So this example may be an example to follow, or maybe an example not to follow. We will see, particularly in these 2 novels that we're going to be talking about today.
So they're very didactic in nature and trying to maybe teach some sort of lesson? Is that what you mean?
In a way, that's what they would be supposed to be, but then when you read below the surface, in the case of Cervantes, you find a lot more meaning than you might think at first. So it is not a novel that's going to necessarily teach you a lesson, but it is a novel that's going to problematize reality somehow and make you think about people's lives and the way that society works or does not work. And that is the way that Cervantes always looks at things. He looks at things in a critical sort of fashion, and he's not just stating something, but he is pointing in one direction, and then it's the reader who needs to draw his or her own conclusions.
Okay, that sounds good. So what 2 exemplary novels are we going to be looking at today?
We're going to be looking at 2 novels that I like particularly. One of them is called Rinconete and Cortadillo. That is the title of the novel, and it's also the name of the 2 protagonists of that novel. And then La Gitanilla in Spanish, or The Little Gypsy Girl, which is actually the first of the exemplary novels in the Cervantine collection.
And if readers are interested in reading these particular novels, can they find translations into English?
Yes, there are several translations into English, some of them way back from the 17th, 18th century, but there are some newer translations that are interesting as well. And a good translation into English would be one that you can find in a book that is entitled actually not Exemplary Novels, but Exemplary Stories, published by Oxford World's Classics and translated by Leslie Lipson. That's the one that I usually go to because it's a pretty good translation, and it sounds pretty modern as far as its diction and its style.
Excellent. So I guess we can delve in. You want to start with Rinconete y Cortadillo?
Yes, I've always been interested in the picaresque novel, which is a kind of novel about criminality, about criminals, rogues. In Spanish, it begins with Lazarillo de Tormes in 1554, then Guzmán de Alfarache in 1599, and then there are different takes on this picaresque novel that became incredibly popular at the time. In England, it was popular as well. There was its own tradition, and we could maybe mention that later. But Cervantes, everything that Cervantes touches, I'm not going to say he turns into gold. I'm not going to say
he's not a Midas.
He's not some sort of Midas, really. But what he is everything he touches, he transforms. He writes a pastoral novel like La Galatea, and he changes the pastoral novel in general.
Okay.
He takes the story of a knight errant, and he changes the romance of chivalry completely. And he did the same thing with theater, for example, and he definitely does the same with the picaresque novel in the case of Rinconete and Cortadillo.
In a way, then he's kind of transforming the genres as they were previously into something kind of new or modern as we know it kind of today, maybe.
That's right, and that's why some people think that Cervantes is the creator of the modern novel, because whether there were novels before Cervantes or not, the modern novel in many ways starts with Don Quixote. In the case of Rinconete and Cortadillo, he changes the parameters of the picaresque novel in several ways. For example, he uses 2 rogues instead of 1.
Okay.
Usually it's the life of 1 rogue. In this case, he's using 2. We know nothing about the origins of the rogues, which is actually goes totally against the canon of picaresque novels, because usually we talk about the origins, the beginnings of the life of the picaro, its transformation as his life unfolds. And etc. This is only an episode in the life of these 2 characters. It's not a whole account of their whole biography.
Okay, interesting.
And it's also a grotesque portrayal of the underworld of Sevilla. Sevilla was a very important city at the time. I'm talking about the late 16th, early 17th century in Spain, because it was the seaport town that linked Spain with the New World, with America. So there was a lot of activity going on there of all kinds, trading and commerce and that sort of thing, but also an underworld of crime.
Interesting. So how does the underworld of crime play into this novel with Rinconete and Cortadillo? Explain maybe what's going on here.
Well, Rinconete and Cortadillo meet by chance at an inn, and they decide to travel together to Sevilla. And when they get to Sevilla, they start, they start trying to live by their wits, and they steal something. But they soon realize that stealing, crime, is okay in Sevilla, but not freelance crime.
What do you mean by not freelance crime?
You can't just show up and start stealing at your free will. There is a brotherhood of thieves and a brotherhood of criminals in the underworld of Sevilla that controls that kind of activity.
Interesting. So it's kind of like a mafia. It has to be within this organization if you're going to participate in this underworld.
And it's exactly that. It's like the it's exactly the description of what we now know as mafia or organized crime. That's what Cervantes presents in Sevilla in this novel Rinconete y Cortadillo. And there is a kingpin of this underworld, and his name is Monipodio. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Monipodio, you may think about Monipodio as a word that sounds a lot like monopoly. This is the man that has the monopoly of the of crime and the underworld in Sevilla. But he is always presented in a very negative, grotesque fashion. He is just somebody to laugh at because he is absolutely grotesque. If you think of mafia kingpin, you normally would think of a description of somebody who is really imposing, and in a way, Monipodio is like that, but he has a lot of characteristics that point more towards the grotesque.
Right. Interesting. So tell me how the story, the narrative evolves and what happens to our 2 characters.
I think the interesting thing about this picaresque novel is that it shows the links between that underworld in Sevilla and the outside, supposedly respectable world and its institutions like the nobility and the church. If the underworld exists, it's because it has connections. It's linked with that outside world that is supposedly respectable, but that makes use of the services of that underworld for their own purposes, and that is how that underworld is supported. So there is a link between the criminals and the church. There's a link between the criminals and the noblemen
Right.
that seek their services, and that allows for the existence of this grotesque underworld.
Now, you mentioned when the novel was published and that it takes place in Sevilla. Does the narrative unfold during that time period, or does it take place prior to?
In many cases, Cervantes does not give information as to that, but it looks like it's pretty clear to me that it is a contemporary account in this case of these two rogues that arrive in Sevilla, and there's a description of the city. There's a description of different places that actually existed in the city at the time. Cervantes knew Sevilla really well. And I think something that is interesting is the role that religion plays
Mm-hmm.
in this underworld, because these are criminals, but they are profoundly, devoutly religious, profoundly, devoutly Catholic.
Right. So, in this, like, being a devout Catholic, how does it respond, or how does it address, or does it, like the Inquisition? Because it is kind of the time, right, more or less, in terms of what's going on in Spain, and then the role it plays maybe in the New World. So, does.
I think that's one of the reasons why Cervantes is so vague about the real intention of these novels. In the prologue, he talks about how these novels should not be taken seriously. They're just entertainment, and that's it. But in reality, he is being facetious about that. He says that because he doesn't want any problems with the Inquisition. But he still uses the novel and its setting and its plot to present issues that were hot issues at the time. These links between the underworld and the church are not something that he made up in his mind. It's something that was apparent to him in the reality of the time. But he claims that this is just for fun, that it's just a novel that you can read for entertainment, like you would go to the
For
movies
laughs,
today.
yeah.
Um, but really, if you really are careful and you really read carefully what the novel really is about. And I would really encourage anyone listening to this to actually do that. Go out, get the book, and read this novel. You will see how it is funny, but it also makes you think about these situations.
Right. So therefore, the novel acts kind of as a technology to critique society at the time, right?
That is right, and that is something that Cervantes always does. He is a very critical writer, and you would have to think of Cervantine literature always as critical literature, because he's always criticizing something. He's always writing against something. He's always thinking against somebody or some group of people in particular.
Find that fascinating. I know that you really enjoy the writing by Cervantes. It makes me think, like, for our readers today and our audience in general, how could they relate to something like this? Obviously, we have sometimes similar issues, hot topics, but maybe kind of expand a little bit with respect to how this, novel could, how one could approach it from a contemporary standpoint.
Well, that's a great question, really, Sylvia. I think the important thing about Cervantes is, and I think this was why he has been such a successful writer in academia. Why he has received so much attention is that the topics that he writes about are really universal topics. They were as true then as they are now. When he's talking about power, when he's talking about corruption, when he's talking about the links between the underworld and the respectable outside society, this is something that happened then and is still happening now. So reading a novel like this makes us think, I think, about the workings of our own society these days. And I think that's why Cervantes has always been so pervasive, and why he has been so interesting to me, because he makes you think about your own reality from a different perspective.
That's excellent. It's really interesting, and it makes me want to definitely go and read that. So hopefully our listeners will do so as well. So, do you want to move on then to the next novel?
Yeah, I think that the best thing about Rinconete y Cortadillo to conclude with this novel is that uh, this is a reworking of a tradition, which is the tradition of the picaresque novel, trying to go beyond the boundaries of that tradition. So Cervantes is really playing with these generic boundaries, and he's presenting criminals who, unlike Lazarillo, for example, and all the other rogues from the tradition beforehand, they are criminals by choice.
Okay.
Once they get tired of this life, and towards the end of the novel, it becomes pretty clear. Once they get tired of this life, they are planning to leave the Brotherhood.
Do they successfully leave the Brotherhood, or should you not?
We don't know.
We don't know.
Really don't know.
Okay.
That is left open.
Is that possible to leave the Brotherhood?
Well, it looks like it would be possible to leave the Brotherhood as it is possible to enter the Brotherhood. But the novel, as I said, it's a moment in time. It doesn't really tell us the whole story of Rinconete y Cortadillo. Only part of it, and so at some point, as though Cervantes were just tired of writing about this, he decides to end it at some point. An open ending, we're not sure. We can imagine that they are intent really on leaving the Brotherhood. Now, whether they can or not, within the fictional framework of the novel, we don't know.
We don't know.
At that point.
Okay.
Little Gypsy Girl, then.
Right? Yay, the Little Gypsy Girl.
You're listening to Tracing Texts.
And I'm Sylvia.
And I'm Anton, and we're talking about Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes, and in particular, these two exemplary novels, Rinconete y Cortadillo y La Gitanilla, or in English, The Little Gypsy Girl. This is the first of the exemplary novels by Cervantes, and I think it has been very often misread by critics as a defense of minorities by Cervantes. Cervantes does defend minorities in many different cases throughout his literary work. But I don't think this is a case of that.
Why do you say that he is not defending minorities? And obviously here we're talking about gypsies.
When you're thinking about the Little Gypsy Girl, of course, the gypsies are an important protagonists within this novel. However, Cervantes is presenting gypsies under not a very favorable light, and this is a connection with the previous novel, really. The gypsies are presented here as criminals.
Okay.
But criminals, in this case, not necessarily by choice. They are criminals because they have to be criminals. That's their way to survive within the society that rejects them. So from that perspective, he seems to be speaking for the minority of the gypsies, which were a minority then as they are now.
Okay.
But if we read deeper into it, we realize that what he's really doing is he's advocating for the rights of women more than the rights of gypsies as a minority.
So you say that he has kind of a feminist, current here in his writing when he's, talks about La Gitanilla?
We could say that, or we could say that he is trying to raise awareness for certain issues that then the feminists later on would raise, even though the feminists, unfortunately, have not really read this novel very closely or not very much.
So there's not a lot of criticism with respect to this particular work?
Not from a feminist perspective, but
Okay.
from other perspectives, yes. Just like everything in Cervantes, there's lots of criticism about Cervantes. But yes, I would say that from that perspective, or talking about this particular topic, not so much.
So how does he raise awareness with respect to women in gypsy society, or women in general in Spanish society at the time?
Well, The Little Gypsy Girl is the story of a noble woman that, as a girl, is abducted by an old gypsy woman and raised as a gypsy. Only that she is not really a gypsy; she is a noble woman. Okay, and so she lives within the society of the gypsies, and The interesting thing is that she is totally different from the rest of the gypsies. Not necessarily in appearance, but in character.
Mm-hmm.
So she is a wonderful singer. She sings with a certain air that the rest of the gypsies really can't. She is incredibly beautiful. I'm not saying the gypsies are not beautiful, but I'm saying that she is presented under such a favorable light that she is almost an unreal character. You know,
Okay.
she is so beautiful that it's almost impossible, right?
Right.
But
What is the name of this character?
the name of the character is Preciosa,
Which means precious.
which means precious, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's part of what we're talking about, right? But really, her name is Constance, right?
Uh-huh.
Because she is a noblewoman that
Uh-huh.
becomes a gypsy. And when she becomes a gypsy, not by choice,
Right.
but by force, she becomes preciosa.
Right.
And she really is precious. And she is so different from the rest of the gypsies that a lot of people think, well, it's incredible that this is a gypsy character or a gypsy person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she should be, many of the characters think that she should have a place in the court with the
Mm-hmm.
noble people. But of course, she is
Right.
a noble woman. So that is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end, because at this point, you know, these characters really don't know that she really is a high class person.
Right.
The interesting thing about the novel, and what I really would like to concentrate on, because I don't want to tell the whole story, it's a little bit convoluted.
Right.
This is referred to mostly as a romance, meaning
Mm-hmm.
an idealistic narrative with improbable elements. I think the interesting thing about this novel starts
Mm-hmm.
when a nobleman by the name of Juan de Cárcamo, okay,
Mm-hmm.
sees Preciosa and falls in love with her, of course.
Of course, that's a typical romance, right?
And bearing in mind, you know, the way that she is described and the abilities that she has, I think I would fall in love with her as well, right?
I wouldn't blame you.
Now, the thing is, of course, these are two. You know, a nobleman and a noble woman. He falls in love with her. She doesn't seem to be necessarily that
As
much
enamored.
in love. Yeah, not as enamored with him as you might think. But of course, Juan de Cárcamo decides to become a gypsy himself, which is totally improbable. That could not happen at the time.
Right.
This happens in literature. It wouldn't happen in real life.
That would just
It would
not
be almost
occur.
impossible. No, it would be almost impossible.
Uh-huh.
Like, why would a noble man in the 16th, 17th century want to
Decide.
become a gypsy? It
Yeah.
just doesn't make any sense, right?
Exactly.
But it happens in this novel, of course, because he is so much in love with her that he wants to be near her. And so he actually becomes a gypsy by going through a ceremony
Mm-hmm.
of initiation, so to speak.
Interesting. Almost like the Brotherhood.
Yes, and again, that's another reason why I'm picking these two
Uh-huh.
novels, because you can see certain
Some
links
parallels there.
in that way. But the interesting thing is what happens at the ceremony.
Uh-huh.
During the ceremony, he is going to take on the name of Andres.
Okay.
Again, this is something that happens a lot in Cervantes, the change of names of the characters.
Uh-huh.
Right? We have Constanza, who becomes Preciosa. We have Juan de Cárcamo, who becomes Andres. We have Alonso Quijano, who becomes Don Quixote. So
Right.
there's
there's
a lot of name changes.
A whole lot of course, this is theory coming from a contemporary perspective, but there's certainly the idea that identity is linked to some sort of performance, as though if one takes on a name or like the trappings of a character, one becomes that character.
Yes, and identity is always
Right.
some sort of performance. What is
Right.
not some sort of performance is personality.
Okay.
People, I think, have personality, not necessarily identity. It's groups that have identity.
Okay.
So Andres is taking on the name and at the same time the identity of the group of
Of the
gypsies
group of gypsies.
in order to be closer to Preciosa, right? Now, the interesting thing now, and I'm going to read very quickly from the novel itself, this initiation ceremony happens, and as part of it, an older gypsy man is explaining to Andres what the laws of the gypsies are.
Okay.
And they are baffling as regards women And I'm just going to, very quickly to finish our discussion, read you a little bit. This is what he says about Preciosa. And he is saying this, the older gypsy, to Andres. This girl, who is the flower and cream of all beauty among the gypsies of Spain, we give you either for your wife or your mistress. It doesn't matter. For in that respect you may do whatever shall be most to your liking, since our free and easy life is not subject to squeamish scruples or to much ceremony. And he says this in the context of a ceremony.
Okay.
Right?
But they're having a ceremony.
Look at her well and see if she suits you, or if there is anything in her you dislike. If there is, choose from among the maidens here present the one you like best, and we will give her to you. Now,
as though they're objects, things to be
exactly.
bartered and sold.
There's absolutely no voice for women within this society. But bear in mind that once your choice is made, you must not quit it for another, nor make or meddle either with the married women or the maids, because we are strict observers of the law of good fellowship. None among us covets the good that belongs to another.
Okay, so adultery is definitely a no-no in this particular society.
Apparently,
Okay, so.
yes. That is the idea. But the reality is not so, because it says, he goes on to say, if a wife or a mistress is unfaithful, so it does happen, right? We do not go as the courts of justice to punish, but we ourselves are the judges and executioners of our wives and mistresses, and make no more ado about killing and burying them in the mountains and desert places than if they were vermin.
Well, that's an interesting take, that the way Cervantes is presenting the gypsies in terms of how they treat women within their society.
So my question is Cervantes openly embracing the laws of the gypsies and supporting them as a minority or not? My answer to that would be, at least in the case of women, definitely not.
It makes me wonder, in terms of the way that this is presented and how they treat women who commit adultery. There is a tradition in Spanish literature, for example, El Médico de su Honra, where we see a lot of honor killings. There's many plays like that. The gypsies almost function as a way to also critique, vestiges of misogyny within Spanish culture.
Yes, and I think Cervantes is definitely doing this here. I don't think he's saying that the gypsies are the only ones who do this, but because he is concentrating on the gypsies here, he is presenting a view or an image of gypsy society that it is contrary to what you would think. It would make sense, you would think, for him to talk for the gypsies as a minority. And he does that in some parts of it. But as relates to women, he is very clear. And he says, this is something that is happening,
right,
that I don't think he agrees with, obviously, because otherwise he would not be showing it and addressing it in his. Now, the interesting thing, to finish, Sylvia, is that women apparently have no voice, right?
Right.
Now, the interesting thing here is that Preciosa actually does have a voice.
A very beautiful voice.
Apparently, yes. Very beautiful voice when she sings, but also a very reasonable voice when she speaks, because she actually talks to Andres about this, and she has her own reply, which I think I will read, if that's okay with you.
Sure, that would be great.
In order to finish the discussion about this particular novel. Preciosa says to Andres about this, whereas these señores, our lawgivers, have determined according to their laws that I should be yours, and as such have given me up to you, I have decreed in accordance with the law of my own will, which is the strongest of all, that I will not be so except upon the conditions heretofore concerted between us two. And so she's asking that he will live among the gypsies for a couple of years before she decides. Now, she has a power of decision here.
Right.
Now, the rest of the women don't, but she does. And she goes on to say, finally, these señores may give up my body to you, but not my soul, which is free, was born free, and shall remain free.
So she has, she claims her agency here, and she decides for herself what she wants.
That's right. Now, the problem is this is not a gypsy girl.
No, she's a noblewoman.
She is a noblewoman.
So what happens to the rest of the gypsy women?
That's right. Exactly. Now she can, but the important thing for me in this case is she is such a reasonable character throughout the whole novel. Reason is the most important thing for her. And she does not think that the laws of the gypsies are reasonable.
Right.
And therefore, she eschews those laws just because she thinks that the only way for her to remain safe in that environment, because of course she doesn't know she's a noblewoman when she's saying all this. Right. She is a gypsy girl, a gypsy right. woman. She could keep up appearances in many ways, but still use her own reason in order to, stay away from these laws that she considers to be unreasonable and pernicious,
right,
terrible for women.
Right. So that's an interesting way that she does that, that she's able to kind of maneuver kind of through this paradigm or system of laws that exists and then, have her own voice and claim her own voice and use reason, like you say.
You're listening to Tracing Texts, our second podcast here. My name is Anton.
And I'm Sylvia.
And we're talking about two Novelas ejemplares, or exemplary novels, by Miguel de Cervantes, published in 1613. And we're about to get to the very end. I think we've been talking here for quite a while, and it has been interesting to me. I hope it's been interesting for people out there. One thing I would say, I would like to remind you that if you would like to read this novel, you can find it in a volume translated into English by Leslie Lipson, published by Oxford World's Classics, and the title is Exemplary Stories by Miguel de Cervantes.
Excellent. So, looking at these two exemplary novels, how would you like to kind of maybe summarize or close? What would you like to tell our listeners that you really want to, kind of reiterate?
What I would like to stress is that Cervantes is probably a writer that a lot of people have heard about, that a lot of people think they know, but it is a writer that has not, by a lot of people, been actually read in depth. We all know about Don Quixote. I don't know how many people really out there have read Don Quixote or the exemplary novels, which are not as popular as Don Quixote. But whether you've read Cervantes or not, reading and rereading Cervantes is interesting to me for many reasons, but most of all because Cervantes is able, with his stories, with his novels, to make us think and rethink about our own culture, about our own society, and about our own laws that rule our lives. These are stories and novels that were written centuries ago, but they are still novels that have very much to do with the reality of our own lives in the 21st century. And I think we read these novels by Cervantes and we will think critically, even more so and much more in depth for having read these novels, because they're not just telling us a story to entertain us, although there's a part of that.
That they're entertaining nonetheless.
They are entertaining, at least to me.
Right.
They are entertaining, but they make us think about the reality around us, and that is the important thing about Cervantes. Cervantes is always criticizing something, is always writing against something, is always making us think about stuff.
Right. Well, I think that I'm so happy that you did bring these novels for the program, because I actually learned a lot and I'm excited to read them as well. I think it's important that we have a critical perspective of our society and culture today. So I'm really happy, Anton. Thank you so much for sharing these two texts for us.
Thank you, Sylvia. It was really a pleasure. And I know that next month we're going to be talking about something different, not about Cervantes, but something that is interesting to you and that you're going to bring us, and that I'm going to be learning quite a bit about.
Yeah, actually what I hope to do, of course we alternate in presenting material that we're interested in. But I want to open up the discussion in terms of what the femme fatale is, or the fatal woman.
Mm.
I have worked with that representation, the depiction of women as being evil, dangerous to men, and I want to kind of start by looking at that and how it's conceptualized in literature written in Spanish, and then perhaps in other podcasts, maybe go into more detail, specific texts or authors.
Well, I can't say I know much about femme fatales, and at least don't think I have met too many. I don't think I've met any at all. But in any case, this is a topic that is very dear to you. It's something that you've been working on, so I'm really looking forward to that next month here on Tracing Texts. Now, we do have a channel of communication with our audience, so if you would like to send some
Comments or
comments, yeah.
questions, we definitely welcome your comments. You can email us at tracingtexts@gmail.com. That's TRACINGTEXTS @gmail.com.
And we welcome any suggestions or any comments that you might have.
And also, we are now on iTunes, so you can download our podcast. And if you have friends, or just please, share this podcast if you like it, and hopefully we can continue doing these shows for you.
Well, that's all from us for today, for this month. This has been Tracing Texts. My name is Anton.
And I'm Sylvia. Thank you so much for listening.
Signing off now from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee.